no one in the chapel dared to breathe. The stench of rot had already seeped through the thick velvet of the coffin, spilling onto the cold stone floor of Sion Abbey. It slithered between the crimson carpets like blood oozing from an unstitched wound. Henry VIII, once the scourge of Rome, the tyrant king who shattered thrones and wives alike, was now nothing more than a bloated carcass, fermenting in the dark. That night, the true horror began. Drawn by the putrid trail, a pack of stray dogs slipped in through the chapel's rear gate, their paws silent, their noses twitching with hunger. They didn't bark, they didn't snarl, they merely sniffed and followed the rivulets of brown, gelatinous fluid leaking from beneath the royal coffin. The embalming had failed. The weight of the king's bloated body, combined with the sealed warmth of the winter-tight chapel, had ignited rapid decay. One dog found a darkened puddle and began to lap it up, slowly, ravenously, as if feasting on royal ichor. Witnesses swore the tale in whispers, how the king who once declared himself head of the church was now being devoured by alley mongrels. None dared record it officially, but among monks and embalmers, the story took root. The coffin itself had been a monstrous task, custom-built to hold a man swollen by illness and gluttony. Resin and linens could not seal what nature refused to contain. The embalmers, choking behind perfumed kerchiefs, carved out entrails and packed herbs into the cavernous torso. But it wasn't enough. Fluids oozed from his nostrils and mouth, those same lips that had sentenced wives to the scaffold, now dribbling with death. By morning, the stains had soaked into the flagstones beneath the coffin. Servants scrubbed. Incense was burned. Orders were barked not to speak of it again. But the smell, like spoiled meat and blood-clotted milk, lingered, and from that wound, the empire began to suppurate. Before the stench, before the bloodletting and dogs, there was light, dazzling and golden like the morning sun on polished armor. The young Henry Tudor, crowned at just 17, did not yet wear the scent of death. He rode like a knight from legend, tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of golden red hair that glowed in torchlight. His skin was pale and flawless, his eyes sharp, the gaze of a man who knew with dreadful certainty that the world belonged to him. A Venetian ambassador once wrote of Henry, "His form is exquisite. In all Christendom, no prince so fair." He danced with grace, jousted with fury, and spoke Latin, French, and Italian with the fluency of a scholar. He was not yet a tyrant, but a god in the making. The people called him their second Arthur, heir not only to a crown, but to a myth. Wherever he walked, eyes followed, not with fear, but with longing. He moved like a lion in court, flanked by noblemen who whispered behind jeweled sleeves of his beauty, his virility, his promise. Portraits from this era captured none of the bloated excess to come, only a waist tight in velvet, a chest braced by muscle, and legs made for war horses. His body was the weapon of a king, and he wielded it as such. He hunted with merciless joy, splitting deer and boar with a single stroke. He raced down falcons and flirted with ladies-in-waiting who blushed at his touch. There were no ulcers on his limbs then, no foul dressings or infected gauze. He bled only in battle, and always nobly. But even in this golden chapter, shadows formed beneath the surface. A taste for spectacle, a hunger for control, and an uneasy need to be adored. Seeds that would rot in time. When Henry looked into a mirror, he saw not a man, but destiny incarnate. And it was from this vision of glory that the fall would be most grotesque. The trumpets screamed as hooves thundered across Greenwich Field. It was January 24th, 1536, cold, gray, and brittle as glass. King Henry VIII, armored and proud, rode into the lists like Mars descending to war. But fate, silent and patient, waited in the mud. The impact came with a snap and a scream. His horse, an immense beast armored to match its rider, reared, stumbled, and collapsed, pinning the king beneath. There was no immediate sound but the clash of steel and the horrified gasps of the court. For 2 long hours Henry did not move. His eyes shut, his lips blue, his men feared him dead. But death is not always merciful. He awoke, and with him a wound that would never heal. His right leg, crushed and torn, festered beneath layers of royal silk. The physicians, barber surgeons with little more than razors and herbs, treated the injury with poultices that stank of rot and ash. But the wound resisted. It reopened. It wept. It never closed. It became an ulcerous crater that hissed foulness every time he walked. The king, once known by scent of rose oil and clove, now preceded himself with the stench of death. Courtiers trained themselves to breathe shallowly. To gag in the royal presence was to risk exile, or worse. His vanity, once fueled by mirrors and praise, twisted inward. The smell humiliated him. The pain maddened him. His chambers were soaked in ointments, and the low whimper of attendants trying not to retch. But worse than the flesh was what broke inside his skull. Whether it was the trauma of the fall or something festering within, Henry's mind began to splinter. He grew suspicious, brutal, irrational. Within months, Anne Boleyn, his second queen, once adored, was accused of incest and treason and sent to the axe. Her guilt was never proven. Her death was certain. Some historians whisper of brain injury, of swelling behind the eyes that twisted perception. Others say it was the beginning of divine punishment. But one truth remains. From that day forward, Henry no longer limped. He lumbered, and the kingdom began to limp with him. The man who once sliced through boars now sat, immobile, breathing hard through layers of velvet and lard. His waist, once narrow beneath gilded armor, swelled past 130 centimeters. His body had become a fortress of fat, a grotesque parody of his former strength. By his late 40s, Henry VIII was no longer a man, but a monument to overindulgence. His appetite ruled court life like another crown. Kitchens roared from sunrise to midnight, preparing feasts that could sicken a legion. Records show he consumed up to 5,000 calories a day. Goose, venison, suckling pigs, trenchers soaked in gravy, pies stuffed with eels, kidneys, marrow. Vegetables were rarely seen, except perhaps as garnish. Wine flowed like blood. Ale, darker than ink, sloshed down his throat in goblets as large as helmets. Every meal was spectacle. Tables sagging under meat, candles illuminating grease-slicked cheeks. But behind the pageantry, Henry's body was revolting against him. The ulcer on his leg festered deeper. His breath was labored. Movement required effort, pulleys, and humiliation. Palace doorways had to be widened. Special rigs were installed to hoist him from bed to chair like a slab of royal meat. Still, no one dared speak of his condition aloud. To comment on the king's size was treason. So ministers bowed and grinned while holding their noses behind sleeves perfumed with rose oil. Even doctors summoned to reduce his swelling or bleed him of bad humors resorted to euphemisms and prayers. The court whispered of one night when the king tried to mount a staircase, only to collapse mid-step, stuck like a whale in a well. 6 men were needed to extract him. He screamed. They wept. And the stench lingered for days. Henry, enraged by his own flesh, turned more violent. He lashed out, dismissed long-serving servants, and questioned the loyalty of those who dared look into his eyes too long. The man who once danced with queens now needed servants to wipe his thighs. His body was no longer his temple. It was his prison, and like all prisons, it demanded guards, silence, and fear. The stench had become part of him. It crawled through court corridors before he arrived, a reeking herald more feared than trumpets. His legs, once powerful enough to launch him from horseback, were now rotting pillars of agony. Beneath the brocade and bandages, they were being consumed from within. The ulcer on his right leg, a wound born from the jousting accident, had transformed into a cavernous maw. Yellow pus wept from it daily, flesh blackened and peeled like overcooked meat. Surgeons, lacking knowledge and driven by desperation, attacked the limb with every tool they had. First came the cauterization, glowing irons pressed against open sores, the hiss of burning meat echoing in the king's chamber. Henry screamed until his voice broke. Then came the mixtures, concoctions of arsenic, turpentine, and mercury, smeared into the wounds in the belief that poison could drive out poison. These remedies did nothing but deepen the rot. Each morning brought a ritual of horror. Blood-letting bowls lined in silver, razor blades glinting by candlelight, physicians with trembling hands slicing open veins to release the humors. They drained him until he fainted, then revived him with wine laced with opium. At times the ulcers split so deeply that white bone gleamed beneath the wet pulp. One witness reportedly vomited upon seeing it. Another fainted. Yet Henry endured it all in sullen fury, demanding more treatment, more pain, more silence. No one dared tell him the truth, that his body was rotting not in spite of the medicine, but because of it. The healers became tormentors, their tools stained red, their robes reeking of death. Courtiers whispered that rats avoided his chambers, that flies circled his bandages but never landed, as if nature itself recoiled. When he walked, if he walked, he left stains behind, foul imprints on rugs and stone. And yet he still signed death warrants, still summoned ministers, still growled orders through clenched teeth. He was a king, not in spite of the decay, but because of it. An empire ruled from a throne of oozing flesh and iron fire. The bells of Hampton Court rang not for joy, but as funeral chimes masked in celebration. In 1540, Henry VIII, bloated and nearly immobile, took another bride, Catherine Howard, barely 19, a slip of a girl with pale skin and trembling hands. The king called her his rose without a thorn, but the rose was planted in rotting soil. He was a creature of meat and blood by then, swollen with disease and pain. His leg, wrapped in layers of linen soaked in pus and clove oil, oozed beneath his wedding garments. He could barely walk, and when he moved, the entire court stiffened at the wafting odor. The groom had to be lifted into bed with Catherine that first night, a scene more surgical than romantic. Some claimed the bedsheets needed burning afterward, others simply prayed. Catherine was terrified. Who wouldn't be? The man she married was 3 decades her senior, his belly like a hanging tomb, his breath foul with rot and wine. His touch, once commanding, was now clammy and uncertain, his hands trembling not from love, but from gout and rage. And yet she had to smile. To recoil would be treason. So she lay beneath him and wept in silence, eyes fixed on the canopy, counting the tapestries like a prisoner counts bars. Outside the bedchamber, courtiers whispered with bile in their throats. Servants lit fires scented with juniper and rosemary just to mask the ever-present smell. One ambassador described the union as a grotesque play of power and obedience, a farce in which the queen was a nursemaid in silk and the king a cadaver demanding affection. Yet for a time, Henry believed himself rejuvenated. He dressed in youthful colors, demanded musicians play till dawn, and declared he felt young again. But no perfume could mask the ulcer that dripped onto his hose. No jest could drown the groan as he stood. Catherine played the role, but her soul shriveled. She sought solace in a young courtier, Thomas Culpeper. Secret meetings, hurried touches, and torchlit corridors. They spoke of escape, of love untainted by disease and fear. But the king's eyes were everywhere, and in that gilded cage, the scent of betrayal soon mingled with the stench of decay. It began with a whisper, too soft to reach the king's ear, but loud enough to echo through walls soaked in fear. Catherine Howard, his rose without a thorn, had betrayed him. She had given her youth, her laughter, her breath to another, and Henry, bloated and festering, could only respond the way his corrupted body taught him to. With blood, his court fell silent. No music, no feasts, only the sound of shuffling feet and veiled glances. Catherine was arrested during a service in the chapel. She screamed, she begged, she clawed at the guards as they dragged her from the pew. Her cries reverberated off the cold stones like the tolling of her own funeral bell. In the king's chamber, the mood was darker still. Witnesses described Henry as unmoving, like a corpse enthroned. His ulcer leaked through the bandages, his breath came in gurgling heaves. He did not scream, he did not rage. He simply stared at the wall for hours, face pale, eyes empty, and then he spoke. "She shall die, and so shall he." Thomas Culpeper, her secret lover, was executed first. Drawn, hanged, and quartered. His entrails burned before his eyes. Catherine's fate was simpler, if not kinder, beheading. But even that mercy came with a cruelty unique to Henry. She was forced to watch rehearsals of the executioner's blade, sharpened and tested on sacks of flour. On the morning of her death, she asked for the block to be brought to her chamber. She practiced laying her head down, again and again, until the motion became second nature. That final morning, she walked barefoot to the scaffold, the icy ground biting at her flesh. Her final words, witnesses say, were, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Henry did not attend. He remained in bed, his legs wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. That night he ordered a feast, though he could barely eat. Musicians played, though no one danced. He laughed once, a dry, raspy noise, and then coughed until he vomited bile onto his robes. The man who once danced with Catherine now watched her ghost pace his corridors in silence. He forbade her name, burned her portraits, and replaced every servant who had looked upon her too kindly. But the rot within him only deepened, for nothing fuels decay more than a festering guilt wrapped in royal silence. The palace grew quieter with each passing month. Doors creaked open more slowly, voices dropped to whispers, and every window was cracked to let the air escape. But no breeze, no frankincense or clove could dispel the growing stench that emanated from the king's chambers. It was not just the smell of illness, it was decomposition in real time. By 1546, Henry VIII had become immobile. The ulcers on his legs, once the size of coins, had consumed whole calves. Flesh had turned black. Gangrene crept like ivy beneath the skin, devouring muscle and nerve. His legs had to be wrapped in thick cloth soaked with myrrh and pitch to stop the pus from dripping onto the floors. But still it seeped, yellow and hot. The king could no longer rise from his bed without aid. It took 6 men to shift him, grunting under the weight of nearly 180 kilograms. Each movement risked tearing flesh. The pulley system groaned under his bulk. Chambermaids tasked with tending to the dressing of his ulcers often had to leave the room retching. Breathing grew difficult. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a dying forge. Fever came in waves, drenching his robes in sweat. Then the chills. His body fought itself, swaying between heat and ice, between madness and silence. Yet no one dared speak of death. English law forbade predicting the monarch's demise. It was high treason. So physicians lied. They smiled, swore recovery was near, while stitching bandages that crumbled in their hands. Even as the king murmured to phantoms, calling for Jane Seymour, or whispering Anne Boleyn's name in a cracked voice, no one would say the word dying. Courtiers wore handkerchiefs soaked in lavender and mint, holding them delicately beneath their noses. But still they gagged. 3 rooms away, the smell was said to linger, sweet rot, burning herbs, and the faint iron tang of blood. Henry, once the Lion of England, now roared only in fever dreams. He cursed ministers for imagined plots. He ordered the arrest of the Duke of Norfolk's son just days before his own collapse. He trusted no one. Food was tasted, knives removed, mirrors covered. And still, every morning, the bells of St. James rang as if the king walked among them, though all knew he could not walk, nor stand, nor truly live. In that chamber of disease, the myth of divine monarchy bled into the floorboards, thick, stinking, and irreversible. He died with a squeeze, too swollen to speak, too weak to lift a hand. Henry VIII's final gesture was the pressure of his fingers around Archbishop Cranmer's palm, his last affirmation of faith, or perhaps a silent plea for release. It was January 28, 1547. The king, 55 years old, finally surrendered to the collapse he had spent years denying. But the horror did not end with his breath. His corpse, already distended by infection and rot, began to betray him. Even in death, Henry's body defied containment. Embalmers, overwhelmed by the sheer size and state of decomposition, worked with trembling hands. The rituals of Tudor preservation were crude, organs removed and packed with herbs, the body sewn shut and wrapped in cloth. But it wasn't enough. He was placed in a massive coffin, custom-built, reinforced with iron studs, but inadequately sealed. They thought the cold stone chapel of Sion Abbey would slow the rot. They were wrong. Within days, the gases inside the king's corpse began to build. The abdomen swelled grotesquely. Liquids, thick and reddish-brown, seeped from the seams of the coffin. By the third night, it leaked onto the floor, forming a dark puddle beneath the catafalque. That's when they came. Stray dogs, perhaps drawn by the warmth of the chapel, or the irresistible scent of decay, found their way inside. One witness, a friar, half mad with horror, described the moment. A dog, thin and shivering, sniffed at the leaking fluid. Then it licked, slowly, methodically. Soon another joined. They drank from the king's remains as if from a trough. Guards drove them off with sticks, screaming, but the damage was done. Word spread like fire. The great Henry, defier of popes, beheader of queens, had been consumed by dogs. Chroniclers tried to bury the tale, but others, eager to mock tyranny, preserved it. The coffin had to be resealed. Layers of pitch and cloth were added, and fresh herbs burned night and day to mask the reek. When the funeral finally took place, 3 weeks after his death, the court wore black not just for mourning, but to hide their pale, nauseated faces. He was buried at Windsor Castle beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son. But the earth could not erase what had happened at Sion. Beneath velvet, gold, and stone, his corpse had burst like a rotting fruit, and in that final leaking moment the illusion of divinity dissolved into sewage. He had once stood above nations, above law, even above God. Kings bowed to Rome. Henry VIII made Rome bow to him. He tore down monasteries, refashioned religion, destroyed wives like pages in a book, and all to bend history to his will. But in the end, that will could not bind his flesh. By the time they lowered his bloated corpse into the vault at Windsor, the myth was already collapsing. The body, embalmed in haste and wrapped in desperate herbs, was not the body of a god, but a swollen cadaver nearly split open by its own gases. Courtiers who had once groveled for his favor now whispered in corners, speaking not of glory, but of stink. His son, Edward VI, the long-awaited heir, would rule only 6 years before dying, childless and racked by disease. The Reformation Henry had so violently forged began to fracture. His daughter Mary, born of the discarded Catherine of Aragon, tried to restore Catholicism with fire and blood. And Elizabeth, child of Anne Boleyn, the queen he beheaded, would rise to become the monarch he never imagined, shrewd, unwed, and beloved. But for all their triumphs, none could erase the image of the king in his final years. Mad, swollen, screaming through festering legs, buried in silks soaked with infection. Not even Holbein's famous portrait, with its chest puffed like a war drum and eyes locked in eternal defiance, could outshine the memory of dogs lapping at leaked royal ichor. The legacy Henry sought, divine rulership, masculine lineage, eternal control, died with him. What endured was flesh, rot, and the knowledge that no one, not even a king who rewrote heaven's order, could escape the body's revenge. Historians would later call it tragic, others poetic. But for those who witnessed the fall firsthand, the servants who changed his bandages, the wives who watched him rage, the men who buried him in silence, it was something simpler and darker. Proof that even kings rot, that the throne cannot mask the corpse, that in the end all crowns sink into the same hungry earth.